Thank you for joining us today. Today we will be presenting on trauma foundations, which is an introduction to trauma foundations for families. Next screen, please. Today, I am joined by two ASD consultants from our team on the school support program at Surrey Place. My name is Lisa Cohen, and I am the manager of the school support program. And with me, I have Karen and Hannah.
Hello.
And today, together, we're going to share with you a little bit of our expertise around understanding what trauma is and how to support your loved ones and yourself going through trauma recovery. Now, before we begin, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands that we're all living, breathing, and playing on today. So I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is situated upon traditional territories. These territories include the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and the Métis Nation. I would also like to recognize the enduring presence of Aboriginal people on this land. Now, before we begin, we do understand that talking about trauma can in and of itself be very triggering for people. We know that for some people, discussions around trauma or trauma-related needs can bring up a lot of intense feelings inside of someone and can be difficult to cope. If at any point you are starting to feel uncomfortable and you are starting to feel like this may be causing you a bit of distress, we ask that you log out. And we just wanted to let you know that there are supports available for you. There are crisis hotlines available 24/7 for you to call. And we've just listed a couple of them based on both Toronto region and our neighboring regions as well. So if you're in Toronto and you're feeling that you need some support, please call 416-408-HELP. And of course, if you're experiencing an imminent crisis where you feel that you're at harm at risk to yourself or someone you love, please call 911 or go immediately to your nearest emergency room. Thank you.
So here's our agenda for today. And I do want to mention, if you have any questions that arise as we're going through the presentation, please feel free to type them in the chat. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation, so we can address any questions or comments that you might have based on the material presented. So first, we're going to just take an overview of what is trauma. We'll talk about something called the window of tolerance. We will look at hyper versus hypoarousal, and then how our senses of safety, connectedness, and hope are affected when we have gone through trauma. We will look at what trauma might look and feel like in each person, and we'll talk about how it might present in different age groups. And then finally, we'll touch on resilience. So taking a look at just what it is, how it comes into play in overcoming trauma, how to use resilience to rebuild our senses of safety, connectedness, and hope. And again, we will look at addressing trauma by age group. So because it will present very differently depending on the age or developmental level of your child, there will be different ways that we can suggest for you to help your child. So first of all, we're going to take a look at a video that talks about toxic stress and how it relates to trauma.
We all want to give our children what they need to grow to their full potential. And as parents, we play an important role in their development. But our parenting is affected by the supports and challenges in our lives, including experiences that cause what's known as toxic stress. Stress is called toxic when it doesn't let up, and there aren't supportive relationships to help us cope. That can make it hard to get through the day, let alone be the best caregivers we can be. The overwhelming burden of toxic stress can affect the health and well-being of adults. It can also affect the development of children in ways that can last a lifetime. Stress that puts us in a constant state of fight or flight can make it feel like we're always on edge, or like it's impossible to calm down. And these feelings can overload our ability to provide the supportive relationships that children need in order to thrive. Think of toxic stress as heavy cargo. Just as a truck can only haul so much weight before it stops moving forward, Challenging life circumstances, like losing a job or not having a place to live, can weigh us down. And just as a truck can break down if it carries too much for too long, we too can wear down from being overburdened without the support we need. When toxic stress is related to things we can't control, like poverty, abuse, or racism, it can feel especially heavy to take on. But experiencing toxic stress doesn't have to determine who we are or how we act. And understanding how stress affects us can empower us to make change in our lives. We all
Okay, so let's take a look at this little guy here. As they talked about in the video we just watched, if toxic stress or toxic stress are left unaddressed, it can build up until a person enters into a state of trauma. And just as the little fellow in this cartoon shows, we all carry stress around with us. You know, we don't see it. Nobody can see the burdens each other are carrying. Some people may have more stress than others. Some people carry it more easily than others. The thing is, we never know how much stress someone's carrying around with them because it's held inside where we can't see it. And as stress builds and builds, a person might become overwhelmed by a seemingly small occurrence. And just as we see in this cartoon, this guy, he already had a heavy load of past trauma, and then the pandemic came, and then that added more stresses. And maybe it could be something as simple as he got a parking ticket or something, and that's the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. And that's what has led him into being in a state of trauma. And, you know, we've all gone through a lot in the past couple of years. Before I started learning about trauma, I thought of it and things like PTSD as something resulting from soldiers being in combat or being in a horrible car accident or witnessing a violent death or something like that. But actually, as we're going to talk about, being in a situation like what we have lived in the past, can you believe it's been 2.5 years, has caused most of us to be in an almost constant state of stress. Which might push us outside what we call the window of tolerance, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. So this has led us to sharing a common experience of trauma. And people who went into the pandemic who had already, like the guy we saw in the cartoon, who already had a heavy load of stress and trauma, that might make them more susceptible to re-experiencing the effects of trauma when they're faced with something like what we've all gone through, like food insecurity, job insecurity, rising inflation, new variants, all of those things. So next up, we're going to look at a video that talks a little bit more about trauma itself.
Trauma occurs when a person is confronted with a threat to their physical integrity of themselves or someone else. This threat overwhelms their coping resources and evokes responses of intense helplessness and terror. Re-experiencing the traumatic event after it is over is often the key impact of trauma. The event occurred in the past, and yet at times, occasionally or frequently, the event dominates the person's individual thoughts, emotions, reactions, and perceptions. For the individual affected, not feeling in control can be demoralizing, scary, and lead them to avoid areas of life. While trauma can greatly impact a person's life, the human psyche does have a tremendous capacity for recovery.
So as he talked about, trauma is an experience of one or more overwhelming, stressful, adverse events. Your ability to cope is drastically undermined. And it's important to note that trauma is not the event itself, but it's what occurs after the event. So within the person and how it affects them and how they deal with it. And also trauma doesn't necessarily have to be something that you yourself experience. It can be something that you've observed. that has caused you to feel traumatized. And if you remember, I mentioned the window of tolerance earlier. So now we're going to take a look at what that means with this next video.
The window of tolerance is a model which helps to understand the variable nature of an individual's capacity and ability to cope and function. We all have zones or ranges of optimal coping and functioning, as shown by the green band in the diagram. This is known as our window of tolerance. When an individual is within their optimal zone or window of tolerance, they are able to experience and tolerate thoughts and emotions, and they are able to cope with the ups and downs, opportunities and challenges of everyday life without much difficulty. They will be more able and likely to take in and process information, think logically, and make informed decisions and respond and behave in developmentally appropriate ways. Windows of tolerance, that is, the degree to which we can cope, will vary from person to person and will vary for each individual depending on what we are doing and what is happening around us. Those who have a narrow window of tolerance may feel as though their emotions are highly changeable or intense, which can be overwhelming and hard to cope with. Others with a wider window of tolerance may feel as though they experience less noticeable ups and downs, or that emotions are not frequently intense and overwhelming. It is important to remember all of us experience emotions, and for each of us, what we can cope with or how much we can cope with will vary. Factors that impact the size of our window of tolerance include the number of demands and stressors we have, life events, including change and transition, and adverse life experiences, relationships and interactions with other people, our stage of development and our physical health, individual factors such as physical health, diet, activity levels, and sleep, repeated or multiple negative experiences such as multiple stressors, traumatic or upsetting life events, challenging or unsupportive relationships with others may narrow our window of tolerance, therefore impacting on our longer-term ability to cope with similar situations or emotional responses. Conversely, repeated or multiple positive experiences, such as minimal stressors, experiences of mastery and pleasure, supportive and nurturing relationships, may widen our window of tolerance, therefore enabling and building resilience, tolerance, and coping. Regardless of the size of an individual's window of tolerance, there are times when everyone is faced with situations that result in thoughts and feelings which are overwhelming and intolerable, which we feel unable to cope with. At these times, we are no longer within our window of tolerance. Our resilience, coping, and functioning become compromised.
So as the video mentioned, a window of tolerance is essentially your state of calm. So, when we think about it in scientific terms, they often talk about a state of homeostasis. Your window of tolerance is that place where you're capable of making rational decisions, engaging in calm and effective problem solving, and having healthy relationships with yourself and with the people around you. But when we're pushed outside of that window of tolerance, we're either pushed into a hyper-arousal state or a hypo-arousal state, which is essentially what you've heard in the past about the idea of somebody in a stressful situation going into fight, flight, or freeze. So our hyper-arousal state would be our fight or flight. That's when your body either decides it wants to run away from the situation or it wants you to fight back. Our hypoarousal state is that state of feeling numb, where you feel like you're frozen and you don't know how to respond and you're not able to respond. Next slide, please. So, in your hyperarousal state, you may feel anxiety, panic, fear, anger, or aggression. And in a hypoarousal state, you may feel depression, fatigue, numb, feeling disconnected or disassociated, feeling checked out, and unfocused. So, trauma occurs when you're in either the pink area or the blue area. And the idea of trauma recovery is to bring yourself back to your window of tolerance or the green area so that you can better address your day-to-day needs.
You know that scared or nervous feeling you get when you have to do something you're not sure you can do? Or go somewhere you've never been before? That feeling is called anxiety. And it can feel a bit different for each person, but it usually doesn't feel very nice. Maybe your palms get sweaty, or your body tenses up, or maybe you get a tummy ache. Maybe you've heard of anxiety, or maybe you haven't, but you've definitely felt it before. Because everyone feels it sometimes. It's normal. You want to know something really weird about anxiety? It's actually trying to help you. It's true. All those uncomfortable feelings, those happen because your brain thinks you're in danger and it wants to protect you. When our muscles tense up and we sweat, it gets us ready to do a lot of exercise, which is helpful if you need to jump out of the way of a runaway train or wrestle a wolverine. Sometimes our minds go blank and we feel like we can't move or talk. That would be great if we needed to hide. Instead, we just feel stuck. When your brain does this, it's called fight, flight, or freeze. The problem is, sometimes your brain gets confused and it can't tell the difference between a charging moose and, say, going to a new school. Both things can be scary and cause anxiety, but there aren't any dangerous wild animals at a new school, hopefully. Understanding where anxiety comes from is the first step in learning to deal with it. So the next time you're in one of those tough situations and you start to feel those feelings, like butterflies in your stomach or sweaty palms, or it gets hard to talk or move, remember, there's nothing wrong with your body. You're just having normal feelings of anxiety, and they're actually trying to help, even if they're not very good at it sometimes.
So, as we've seen, trauma's effects can be felt physically and is not necessarily just something that we think about or remember. We can find our emotions, which may have been stable and easily understood, to become unpredictable and harder to control. We may not notice feeling annoyed, then irritated, and then getting very angry. So to others, it may seem that after we've had trauma, we may get angry just out of nowhere, or the rage just seemed to come out of the blue. But it is sometimes anger that comes from no longer being able to recognize things that are upsetting. Or as the previous cartoon showed, it could be that, we've already got all kinds of things weighing down on us. We're already almost out of our window of tolerance. So being quick to get upset or irritable may be noticeable. In some cases, it can cause us to experience too much emotion, too little emotion, or no emotion at all. You may see some numbing. If you hear a joke and the people that you're with are all having a laugh, you may just think it's really not that funny, and so you feel a little bit suppressed or numbed. You may have trouble experiencing happiness, joy, things like that. Alternatively, if you're in a situation where you're also sad, trauma may interfere with you being able to express those emotions as well. Anxiety or worries may be expressed more strongly and overgeneralized. So what I mean by that is a person may start worrying about many things that they didn't worry about before. Things that didn't make you anxious before may make you anxious after you've experienced trauma. Some people may even experience panic attacks, which they may not have before. And I mean, those can feel like a medical emergency. They can be very distressing. Sometimes trauma can also precede depression, feelings of shame, worthlessness, or hopelessness. It becomes hard to see your future, imagine what your life would be like in a month, a year, or longer. Anger is very common in people who have trauma. Trauma can also affect our relationships and can take a toll on them. Someone who has experienced trauma may have a hard time trusting again. They may have difficulty with intimacy and closeness. They may actually be kind of afraid of people. So they may have been more outgoing prior to experiencing trauma. Maybe they're a little less outgoing now. I mean, if we think about the pandemic, a lot of people have expressed that during the last 2.5 years, their teenager or younger child just seems a little less interested in going out and hanging out with friends. They spend a lot more time on social media and reaching out that way. So they've sort of withdrawn a bit. Not everybody, but a lot of kids have withdrawn or just felt more isolated or felt more cocooned when they're isolated. It can also make it hard for you to recognize what is really a dangerous situation and what is not. Your brain can overgeneralize and look at everything as being potentially dangerous rather than an immediate actual dangerous thing or what was dangerous that occurred during your trauma. Trauma can also affect how your body physically feels. You may have feelings like you're reliving the experience. Some people have described flashbacks, which would be like feeling like you're in a movie replaying your trauma. You may hear something that was involved with your trauma. You might be walking somewhere and hear a noise that you weren't expecting, and it sort of clicks play on reliving a trauma that you may have been through. I thought of an example about when I hear coughing or sneezing, sometimes I feel kind of tense and I'm like, oh, I hope they don't have COVID. Or, some people might experience like a loud bang and have a over exaggerated startle reaction to something like that. Their body feels tense. So sudden noises, someone coming around the corner unexpectedly can cause just that tension to, go through their limit, and it might be a much bigger reaction than one would expect. You may notice that the person or yourself are having problems falling asleep or staying asleep, waking up and not refreshed. You just feel like you're dragging a weight behind you all the time. Also, sometimes someone with trauma may have more physical ailments. So chronic toxic stress can, and we're going to get into this a little later, so I won't go on about it, but it can affect your health and your immune system. We can also have changes in how we think and the way that we think. Problems with attention, concentration can happen. You may find that you're having to reread something, or you might have to ask somebody to repeat themselves. You may have, walk into a room and think, why am I in here? And that does happen to everybody sometimes. For someone with trauma, it can be very pervasive, very frustrating. And sometimes there are intrusive thoughts, and these thoughts can get in the way of day-to-day living. So it can really, in trauma and toxic stress can really affect how your mind is working. So when we look at behavior and how trauma can affect behavior, sometimes we see people engage in a lot of avoidant behaviors. So they want to avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma. So it could be, if someone was in an accident, they may stop driving and only take public transportation. That's just one example. It can also be avoiding people associated with an event, places associated with the event, activities, anything like that. Sometimes, unfortunately, people with trauma who have a difficult time expressing themselves can engage in self-harm or self-injurious behavior. And if someone's not able to communicate, or if they struggle, or they're very young or nonverbal, you may see these really tense, anxious, really hard feelings come out more in that kind of fashion. And when we refer to abusing others, that could be something that happens resulting from trauma. So it could be, they've come home from work, they've had a really hard day at work, they've been stuck in rush hour traffic, they are supposed to be somewhere for, let's say, 6 p.m. So there's a lot piled on, like the person in the cartoon. And then when they come home, somebody asks them to do something. Could you please take me here? Or can you do this for me? That could cause someone who's experienced trauma to kind of explode and maybe lash out at the person that they love, a family member, friend, coworker. It could cause them to be abusive to that person. And then, that's where we might see feelings of worthlessness come back as well, where after they've cooled down and had this bit of explosiveness, they just think, I'm a terrible person. I can't believe I did that. What's wrong with me?
Let's take a quick look at how trauma might manifest in a child. So there can be, sorry, Anna, can you? Yeah, that's okay. So problem-solving challenges, things that they typically or historically knew how to do really well. They might not remember the steps they need to take to solve problems. There can be social skills challenges, so getting in more fights or being unable to maintain friendships with kids that they've been friends with before. Chronic health issues like, digestive issues like constipation, or just a chronic, frequent colds, even something like that. Self-regulation challenges. So the slightest thing can set them off, whereas typically they might have been very even-tempered before. Now, little things might cause them to explode. Challenges with learning. If a child is in a constant state of fight or flight, they're not able to take in any new information. So that's going to impede their learning, and changes in the brain as well. Actually, there can be physiological changes in the brain. So next, we're going to take a look at how trauma might manifest in different age groups. And so like these age groups, they can be chronological or developmental. So you might have an older child with a developmental challenge. So if they go through trauma, they might present at a younger age. So for preschool age children, you might notice them being really clingy, and not just when you're dropping them off at school, but even not letting the caregiver leave the room or leave their side. They might regress in their self-help skills. So a child who has been reliably potty trained may start having bathroom accidents. You might see trauma coming out in their play. So for example, if they were in a car accident, they might recreate that with their toys. The next age group we're going to look at is elementary age. Yep, just click there. Yep, there we go. Elementary school age children. So they might be more fearful than normal. They might be clingy. Have, again, as we talked about, having a hard time concentrating, be very afraid that the event is going to happen again. You might notice some sleep disturbances, or changes in school performance as well. And then finally, with the older kids, the middle and secondary age kids, you might notice some depression. And Hannah mentioned just needing that cocooning, that just not wanting to socialize, wanting to be alone. There might be some attempts to numb the trauma with drugs or alcohol. They might start risk taking, and I believe Hannah mentioned that as well. Again, sleep disturbances, avoiding situations or places that remind them of the event, and just general changes in their ordinary demeanor.
So trauma really impacts three areas of our well-being, and these are three very important areas that we need to be in healthy states so that we can maintain that window of tolerance. So those three areas are our sense of safety, our sense of connectedness, and our sense of hope. So our sense of safety really refers to our sense of security. It's the belief that your needs and the needs of those who you love are being met. Our sense of connectedness is the ability to have healthy relationships with other people and have a circle of support that you feel not only are able to support you, but also understand your experience. And finally, hope is that expectation that everything's going to be okay and everything will work itself out. So we know the pandemic has had drastic impact on our three areas of well-being. It has really impacted our sense of safety. We know that there's been loss of income for many, food insecurity, issues with housing and affordability, and the current state of our economy. A lot of restrictions, health scares, lack of social supports have led us to disconnect from our circles of supports that we once rely on. So not being able to see our friends and family. Many people lost loved ones that they relied on during the first few waves. So it's really impacted our ability to feel connected to other human beings. And of course, that feeling of hope has been drastically impacted because we've gone to a world where we don't even know what's happening from day to day. So having the stability of being able to plan for the future and think long term has become very difficult for many of us. So how do we get back into these three areas of well-being? Well, we do that using resiliency skills. So resiliency are the tools that we need to overcome trauma, is the ability to cope with loss, change, and trauma that have become part of our lives. Resiliency skills help people to adapt to the life-altering events that they've occurred. So that means being able to stay focused, flexible, productive, being able to have healthy and ongoing relationships with people, and being able to communicate effectively. It helps us cope with chaotic and unstable situations at times. So those are those coping skills that we need when we're feeling afraid, so that we feel less afraid, and so that we feel that we have the ability to tackle these new and unknown experiences, but knowing that we can handle anything that comes our way. Coping also allows us to manage the strong emotions that come with being pushed into our hyper or hypoarousal states. And finally, rebounding is the ability to bounce back from the hardship and tragedy. So rebounding provides us with a sense of self-esteem and a sense of belonging, and being confident that we can problem solve and find solutions to any problem. So using resiliency to rebuild our sense of safety, we have to remember to practice acceptance. And that doesn't just mean acceptance of others. That also means practicing acceptance ourselves. So acknowledging that things have changed and we have to find new ways to do things. And the things that we used to know may not be relevant anymore, and that's okay. Practicing self-awareness, knowing your limit, knowing your boundaries, and being able to say to yourself, well, I'm having trouble sleeping, or I have a change in appetite, and that's because my mental health is impacting my sense of maintenance or my window of tolerance. Practicing self-compassion, telling yourself it's okay not to be okay, and creating boundaries when interacting with others is really important. So a great example is the news. In my house, there's a policy that kind of states that nobody's to leave a news station running 24/7 so that somebody else who walks into the room might be triggered by what's going on with the news. So setting healthy boundaries and ensuring that those around you are implementing it is a great way to rebuild your sense of safety. To rebuild your sense of connectedness, try to reach out to people again, whether it's a phone call, a text message, or even a Zoom video call. Any opportunity you have connects with others is going to help you feel more connected. Wherever you can, demonstrate compassion to others and understand that while you've gone through a trauma experience, so have they. And find opportunities for humor and laughter. We talk a lot about the negatives of social media, but it also provides an opportunity to look at funny memes and watch funny videos. So take those opportunities and enjoy them. And finally, show gratitude for the simple things in life. Remind yourself of all the good things that you have and try and shift that narrative from a negative to a positive. And rebuild our hope. That means finding new meaning and purpose in our life, setting new goals and having new expectations is going to help us rebuild that sense of hope. Try and stay motivated, set small goals and realistic goals so that when you achieve them, you feel that sense of ownership and you also have a bit of a motivation to keep moving on. Be optimistic and solution focused in the activities that you do. So come with an intention and make it be positive. And practice positive reframing. So finding a way to reframe your negative thoughts to positive. So rather than looking at all the bad things that happen, what are some of the good things that have come out of them?
So let's have a look at how we can support kids by different age groups. So with young children, therapy may not be the way to approach trauma recovery. Traditional talk therapy I refer to. Play therapy, role playing, art, music therapy can help kids move back into their window of tolerance and more to a state of like stasis, for example. Help children verbalize their feelings so that they don't sort of feel siloed in their strong emotions. Provide consistent caretaking. So build in routines, be places when you say you're going to be places. Sometimes things happen and we can't, but as much as you can, you know, make sure that kids are picked up at the same time every day. And build in, you know, bedtime routines, stick to those, have lunch, etc. at the same time. If you are not going to be able to stick to a routine, it's really helpful for those younger kids, preschool age kids, that you just make them aware of where you're going to be, how long it will be until you get there. Also, we may need to accept that there's going to be some regression sometimes for some preschool age children in self-help and life skills. And rather than bring attention to that and say, you know what, you're able to use the bathroom. What's going on? How come you need diapers? So just accept those things and try to move forward and just be as supportive as possible. For elementary age children, encourage them to express the fear, sadness, and emotions that they have. I know sometimes it's tempting to say, you know what, this thing that you're upset about, this isn't really a big deal, but it's actually most helpful if we can validate. And what I mean by validate is say, the feeling that you're having, I can understand that. It looks like you're very upset about this. Would you like to talk about that? So not just sort of shutting down someone's emotional response to something, meaning well and trying to put it in perspective from an adult frame, but for a young person, they may really just need someone to say, this feeling is okay, and I see what you're going through, and I'm understanding, and I'm there for you. Correct distortion of traumatic events and some of the details that they're sharing. So if they're internalizing or they're remembering things incorrectly, if you can gently and kindly just sort of correct those memories, that would be very helpful. And keep in communication with the community partners and educators that are around them. And support your children in letting teachers know when the kids are getting overwhelmed, or if they can identify when they're going out of their window of tolerance, maybe if they can share that, or if what they're experiencing is preventing them from learning or absorbing what the teacher is telling them, encourage them to be able to talk to their teacher. And for the middle and high school age children, encourage discussion of the event. You know, if they want to talk about feelings and things like that associated with the event, be open and ready to talk about that. You can discuss anticipated changes or strains that they may go through because of trauma and how it affects them. Offer support in any sort of social or relationship challenges that they're having. And if your teen or middle schooler is demonstrating some acting out behavior, talk to them about where that may be originating from and that it might be actually rooted in trauma. And if they have thoughts of getting back at someone, doing something violent or whatever, help them address the consequence of those actions and think of constructive alternatives. As Karen said, sometimes problem solving kind of falls apart a little bit when kids' brains are affected by trauma. So if we can help them figure out some problem solving or constructive alternatives, that can be very helpful. And one message as well for this age group, validation is very, very helpful. So in conclusion, I just want to say thank you for coming today. And remember, the key to trauma recovery is to engage in self-care. Be kind to yourself, have some self-compassion. You want to be able to be in a calm state yourself so that you can help your child who may be experiencing trauma. This engaging in self-care and self-compassion and gratitude will help return you back to your state of your window of tolerance as well. And now I would just like to open this to any questions that there may be.
Lisa, you're muted.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, can you please give an example of validations for teens? Is it just letting them know you see their feelings?
So validation, when I use the term validation, what I want to avoid is saying that if someone is, let's say, upset and trashing their bedroom, we wouldn't say, wow, you look pretty angry and I can, you know, I just want you to know that I understand. Because that is, you know, you still want to rein in some of the behavior that you might be seeing like that. Again, talk to them about, well, the consequences of it. So, but specifically when I talk about validation, it would be something like, imagine if your child comes home and they've had a really bad day with another student that has been picking on them. They're out of their window of tolerance. They're very upset. They come home and they say, I can't stand Sally or Jeff or whoever. I just want to kick them when I see them again. So validating would be something like, you know what? I can understand why you might feel like that. And it's not adding on anything. It's not taking away from anything that they feel. It's recognizing that they're feeling it. And in a younger person, let's say a younger person has built something out of Lego and they dropped it and it broke. So now they're incredibly upset. It seems like they're more upset than what the situation calls for. To validate someone in that age group, for example, you might say, so if they come and say, I can't believe this happened, I just want to throw the whole thing in the garbage. You might validate by saying, wow, you worked really hard on that, didn't you? You seem very upset about it. And then we don't move into problem solving right then. We wait to see if that can help bring them down a little bit. And with validation, I'm not going to say it's a magic wand, but just feeling heard and respected, and that, you know, what they're feeling is understandable. Sometimes that is enough to help bring them back down a little bit to a state of sort of like stasis. I mean, I think we've heard the joke that the worst thing you can say to an upset person is, "Hey, just calm down." That doesn't usually help, because one, you're not validating what the experience is. It doesn't offer tools on how to do that. It doesn't offer any kind of proactive solution. So really the idea of validation is to just help them identify and just say, you know what, that makes sense. It makes sense that you would be so mad about what happened today. I can totally understand that. So when I talk about validation, that is more, that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get across.
And I should add with teenagers, I think another really good point that Hannah's making, it's not to say that you're validating a teen's feelings and that's an excuse for them to behave the way, the negative behavior that you're seeing. I have a teen that I just addressed this with recently. It's to say to your teen, I understand that you have experienced this negative thing and it may be making you feel the certain way. And perhaps that's a little bit, behind why you're doing X, Y, and Z. So being able to validate it means also being able to address it and acknowledge that it's there. Because I think sometimes, especially with teens, a lot of the time they feel like the adults around them are not actually listening to them and are not really hearing what they're saying. So just making them feel like, I recognize that life's not easy right now and it's okay not to be okay, but we still have to be responsible and we still have to do the things that we need to do. So sometimes validating is just about being able to sort of open that door for communication. We have another question. Do you think children that live with ADHD and its effects could in fact be a sort of trauma? Absolutely. I think any diagnosis of any sort is a trauma experience. It's a trauma experience not only for the people supporting that child, but it's a traumatic experience for that child themselves. I grew up with a sibling that had ADHD, and now that we're both adults, I mean, we talk regularly about that diagnosis and the effects of trauma. I mean, anytime that you are engaging a child in any sort of intervention, whether it's tutoring or it's therapies or it's OTs or PTs or doctors or anything that's outside the norm, is going to make that child experience, those feelings outside of that window of tolerance. And that is going to create some level of trauma for a child. That's a really great question.
Something I would like to add to that, if I might. Sometimes a person has ADHD. Stop. But if you know that there's trauma in their background, then everything Lisa said is completely, I would agree with. But I do just want to remind any listeners that you can have an independent diagnosis of ADHD. And I think that is definitely something that you'll want to explore with the diagnosing medical professional.
Yeah. And I think in terms of how you mitigate that trauma experience for your children, I think it's really important that you engage them at their level, using the right language and based on their developmental age, not necessarily their chronological age, but you ensure that, things are being explained. And, the reason why we're asking you to do A, B, and C is because we're looking for X, Y, and Z. I think sometimes what contributes to trauma is children feel like they've been left in the dark and they're being pulled from, person to person or treatment to treatment, but they don't necessarily know why, or they feel like they don't have a voice or a choice. So just remembering, like, children in this country have rights. And even when you feel that you're making choices for the best interest of your child, which undoubtedly you are, bringing your child into that conversation, being open and transparent and explaining why you're doing what you're doing, or you're asking them to do what you're asking them to do, can do a lot to reduce any sort of trauma experience. Okay. We want to thank you for joining us today. We know we did go over time, and we appreciate you hanging in there with us. We will share the references with the event organizers so that the links can be posted and you can access them as well. So thank you very much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day with the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.